It's another report from the jam-packed Freedom Conference that took place in Victoria, BC, called Reclaiming Canada. And today we're going to have a discussion about the fear Canadians have been living with over the last 2 years during life with COVID-19 and all the restrictions that came with it. And who better to speak to with that than a former psychotherapist for years, Vaccine Choice Canada's Ted Coots. But before I shoot to that candid interview with him, I want to let you know that Rebel News, in case you're unfamiliar with us, we are independent journalists and we're also independent of government interests. That means we don't take a penny from the federal government's media bailout, unlike over 90% of the media you see elsewhere. Instead, we bring you these reports, we travel to these places, and we show you what's really going on in the freedom movement and many current affairs because of people like you who chip in to help us afford the cost to do so. So if you'd like to support independent media, you can do so by going to rebelfieldreports.com. You can open up a device and just click on that and donate what you can. And we really appreciate your support for doing so. And here is Ted Coots. Is fear worse than the virus? And how are people in Canada and across the world so comfortable with some of their unvaccinated friends and family members not having the same rights as they do? Beside me is Mr. Ted Coots from Vaccine Choice Canada, who also worked as a psychotherapist for years. We're going to talk about those two things. Thank you for being on Rebel News today.
Thanks for inviting me. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, last time I think we saw each other at a protest.
Was that the Bill Gates protest in Vancouver? Yes.
That's right. You can check that out. I'll link it in the written report for this in the description below. But let's talk about the level of fear. It's been on all sides, I would say. You know, some people are very afraid of COVID-19 and being around people, whether they're vaccinated or not. But I've even met people who are unvaccinated and fearful of those with the vaccine. Have you come across that?
Absolutely. So, I mean, that whole phenomenon of shedding from the vaccinated to the unvaccinated has many people that were unvaccinated concerned about being around vaccinated people. So I want to say that they did a masterful job of separating us and making us afraid of each other. And it has really broken down the fabric of society and families by that. I mean, I have, one of my stepsons has said that he didn't want to be around me while I was attending rallies, and you know, it's hard. It's hard on families. It's hard on community.
You know, it's interesting you said that. I covered I can't even, too many to count, protests during the thick of the declared pandemic. And I got to tell you, myself and no one at the time was getting sick until after the vaccines rolled out. I don't know what that is, but it was at the end of summer where it seemed like COVID-19 started going through the freedom community. But we saw Montreal, for example, have, I think, over 100,000 people go to a rally and no crazy spike afterwards. So very interesting. But let's get back to what you think maybe people need to know on all sides of the fence about fear and mental health, no matter which way it's coming from, and how that has sort of impacted society over the last 2 years during life with COVID-19.
Well, I think people need to understand how destructive fear is. And they also need to understand that from a psychotherapist perspective, what I would teach my clients is that fear is never about what's happening in this moment. It's all about what you think might happen in a future moment. Mm-hmm. And so people that are afraid, it's not a threat that they're actually facing at this moment. It's a threat that they imagine facing. And the problem is our imaginations can be very harmful to us when we spend so much time telling ourselves a negative story.
Well, when you say that, it reminds me of mandates in general. It was always about what if. Every mandate was about what could be, and that was used as an excuse to lock us down and to do that to children in particular. How about we talk a little bit about that? These children statistically were more likely to die on the way to school in a car accident than they were to die from COVID-19. But the level of fear that some of them must have had, you know, no longer could they visit grandma. They had to distance from their kids, their buddies in school. Let's talk about what effects you think that might be having on our children then and to come.
Well, to me, it's really damaging because it's now moved into a chronic state of fear. So it's not like there's an imminent threat. There's something that happens, you respond to it, and then you're done with it. We've been living in a chronic state of fear for 2 years, and the children don't know how to manage that properly. They don't have sophisticated enough, and I would suggest most adults don't either. And so children often, they just absorb the emotional climate of a house or a community, and they're not in a place of power to actually address how to get safe. So what you're seeing is kids who have chronic anxiety disorders, and that can show up in behavior that becomes challenging behavior. It can show up in bedwetting when they've had bladder control since they were 2 years of age or whatever. So what I'm hearing from parents is that their kids are not, they lost developmental gains. And the research is telling us now that the children, particularly those as a result of both the fear but also the masking, have caused a regression in children's development. And these are consequences that are real, and we don't know how long-lasting those consequences might be, how long it would take a child to actually reclaim that lost ground.
Yeah, you mentioned the loss of academics with kids. My colleague Dakota did a good article on that. I'll link that as well. And we also saw the attempts for children to try and end their life, suicide, go up. And you think that that would be when we were talking about protecting the vulnerable with lockdowns. You think that would have shifted our focus, that we needed to change. Something else that's always really intrigued me is when you look at history, when you look at the times where society has become afraid of citizens that they live with and turn their back and started to snitch and call on police, the Holocaust comes to mind, is sort of how all of a sudden dehumanizing other citizens becomes normal. I know I interviewed former Holocaust survivor Vera Sharav. I'll link that as well below.
The Nazis used the fear mongering of Jews as spreaders of infectious diseases. And that's exactly the accusation against the unvaccinated, that they're the spreaders of the virus where they're not. Healthy people do not spread disease. So that was the first thing. And then, of course, the segregation.
And she would agree that the unvaccinated are being dehumanized, and she believes in the same fashion. I wonder what your opinion is, based on with your experience, what your opinion is on that.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I also interviewed Vera and heard her story. And people, when you talk about the Holocaust, and they say, "Oh, it's not like that," it's not like that in terms of the gas chambers, but it is like that in how a group was marginalized. They were shamed. They were made to be less than, and that caused a justification or a callous disregard for the harm that was being done to that section of the population. We're seeing that now. I mean, I find it shocking that so many of my fellow citizens, including my own family, seem that it's quite all right that I don't have the same rights and freedoms that they have. And, I had a difficult conversation with a brother of mine who said, well, you made the choice, and so that's your fault. And, my response is, that's not choice. That's coercion. I think we're living in systemic extortion. And if that existed in any other way, if we said to somebody, give me $10,000 or I'm going to burn your house down, and they give you the $10,000, we don't say, well, you had a choice. But somehow we have allowed this narrative to grab hold, and good, decent Canadians, good, decent people are behaving in callous ways. That's the part that I think is so alarming about how destructive this has become for our social fabric.
Well, to do this interview, we had to pull you up out of the We Unifies Reclaiming Canada conference. It's a full packed conference. We're doing many reports on it that you can find on our website. But it's a message of unifying the people and coming together to find a legal way to restore freedom in Canada. So when you talk about the fear that we've been living in, what advice maybe do you have for people watching, or what do you believe needs to happen so that people can get out of that state of fear?
Well, I would suggest the first thing they should do is they should be turning off their TVs to the corporate-controlled media, because there's an agenda that's coming through there, and the messaging is constantly about fear, fear, fear. So you need to step away from that and then develop some distance so that you can now have some clarity to begin to actually evaluate the science, evaluate the data. And the data shows is that the majority of the population are not at risk of COVID. And the problem is that our government, our public health, our mainstream media is delivering a message that we're all at risk, and that's just not true. So one is stop stop sticking your finger in the light socket. Mm-hmm. The second one is go and find the data and actually examine it for yourself about what the risk really is. And if you do that thoughtfully and responsibly, what you'll realize is that it's not a risk. And so you're being played, and we need to stop allowing ourselves to be deceived.
Well, there you go. Words of wisdom from Ted Coots from Vaccine Choice Canada. You can check out the last interview to get a little bit more of your story, but you go to the website and see everything that this organization has been doing, especially over the last 2 years during life with COVID-19. Thank you so much for being on Rebel News.
Thanks for having this time with me. Appreciate it.
Do you have a story that Canada should be aware of about how fear has ruined your life during COVID-19 and restrictions? If so, I'd like to hear about it. You can go to pandemicwhistleblower.com and let me know. And also, if you want to help cover the cost for this report, you can donate at rebelfieldreports.com.